And I'm going to turn it over to Noelle today, and I'll start sharing the PowerPoint, and she can welcome us for some exciting news that they have to share from the department. Welcome, Noelle.
Morning and hello everyone. We're so happy to be with you again with your TeleTuesday call. And we're also happy that this week we're not saying to you that we're waiting for something to come. So the early on guidance document has been posted to the Michigan Department of Education site, and that will be the topic of our conversation today. Before I move further, I would like to introduce Laura Goldthwait and Colleen O'Connor, who will be co-presenting with me. I think you two can say hello.
Good morning, this is Colleen O'Connor.
And good morning, this is Laura Goldthwait.
And you see us smiling because we finally have the guidance out. And we know kind of on the upfront that this isn't the end of our guidance. You will continue to hear from us, but we're glad to have some official guidance out with you today. Okay, so an overview of our agenda today is actually fairly similar to what we've had the last couple weeks. We'll be doing a review of the guiding principles, kind of take a look at the current state and federal guidance and some resources behind that. We'll discuss a bit the Executive Order 2020-65, which was just released last Thursday. And then we'll talk about the MDE early on guidance document, which was released yesterday afternoon. So I know I've had conversations with several of you that have read this, and we're just starting to get your arms wrapped around this. And we're here today to help you kind of get your arms wrapped around this even more. We anticipate more questions. Like I said, we anticipate more guidance to come, but this is a good next step for us. And it's a good next step that the early on guidance is aligned with the executive order. There's been a lot of intentionality at the MDE and with the governor's office to help make that happen. So, as ever, we will start with a review of the guiding principles. You see a few more words here. That's really because we've been listening to you all and we're stealing a few of yours. So we heard the word individualize from a few of you last week, and how that's a really important message that we've never done one size fits all with early on, and this isn't the time to do that, that all of our service area situations are different and all our family situations are different, and also ensuring that we have documentation out there. So moving forward with a priority on the health and safety of yourself, your staff, your families is of paramount importance. We thank you for your best faith efforts and your flexibility during this health crisis. And with that, flexibility is important. We are learning ourselves that every day is so different and also very much the same as we're working from home. So please continue to document your choices, your rationale, and remember to make prior written notice your friend. This keeps everyone on the same page, and we appreciate your efforts to keep that happening. Also kind of remembering to keep your LICCs and your stakeholders fully engaged during the process. Keeping them mindful of these guiding principles that you're running your programs by during this process of planning and implementing as everyone's work changes. The LACC is valuable in helping to advise and guide your work with family and community voice. So kind of a quick flyover of our current state and federal guidance. This slide looks the same as it did last week, but the content behind it will not. These are live linked, and I believe these links will be put in the chat for you. So with executive orders, I took a look at those yesterday and they are flying in. But what we're talking about specifically today will be Executive Order 2020-65 that provides some clarifications around school closures for early childhood programs and services, as well as K-12. The U.S. Department of Education has had a few additional resources and guidance added in the last week or so. So as ever, I'll recommend that you take a look at the U.S. Department of Ed site, especially if you're running other programs and services. The MDE information and resources in the last week, what has been added has been guidance under the early childhood page on the COVID-19 information and resources, including the early on memo and guidance. In addition, you will see Head Start guidance, 32P, 32P4, or Great Start Collaborative, Great Start Parent Coalitions, and home visiting guidance, and GSRP. So all 4 of those have been added as of yesterday on the Michigan MDE information and resources. Additionally, a new tab. I'm not sure if I mentioned this last week, so I'll throw it out there again. A new tab has been added to the COVID-19 resource page for family engagement. So you'll see additional resources aligned with MDE's definition and principles for family engagement. So that might offer you a few more potential resources in supporting families during this crisis. Finally, additional resources. They're always changing. Great things are being added often. The ACTA site, the Early Childhood Technical Assistance Center, they have many webinars that are coming up that look high quality and super appropriate for the place that we're at right now. Early on Training and Technical Assistance Center, they continue to add very timely research-based resources, and that would include our PowerPoints and presentations that we're sharing with you in TeleTuesdays. And the Michigan Alliance for Families, they continue to add additional resources, from my checks, about weekly. Okay, so let's move on to a discussion about Executive Order 2020-65, which states that in-person K-12 instruction, the Great Start Readiness Program delivery, and early childhood programs are suspended for the remainder of the 1920 year and requires development and implementation of a plan for learning at a distance. The requirement in this executive order to suspend all person instruction also applies to early on. Early on is not specifically named in Executive Order 2020-65, but is included under early childhood programs and services. This is inclusive for IDEA Part C, both for children eligible for Part C only and for children eligible for Part C with Michigan mandatory special education services. So it's inclusive of all of that. As we discussed or tried to forecast for you last week, this executive order does include all of the MDE Office of Great Start Early Childhood Education Programs and Services birth to 5, as I just named. So we are expected, and I don't know anybody who isn't, most of you, if not all of you, are to provide remote early intervention services. So this means that early on referrals, evaluations, and services are expected to continue, but we all know that this is in a modified form. So required that early on be included in the ISD's continuity of learning plan. And if it's not included in the ISD's continuity of learning plan, then there would be an expectation that a separate plan be developed. So these plans do stay at the ISD level. You do not submit them to the MDE, but they do stay at the ISD level. The MDE will need to collect certain data for the OSEP reporting under the COVID-19 pandemic and continued services. So we do anticipate a report and a requesting of data from all early on programs in the coming weeks. This is data that the OSEP has been requesting since this pandemic started, and they stated that it would be part of our monitoring responsibility under COVID-19. And in addition, I'll throw it out there again, remembering stakeholder engagement in the development and implementation of your learning plan. So the purpose of the early on guidance document is to align ourselves to the executive order, to kind of dig in a little deeper with the executive order and state what the implications would be for early on programs, as well as to provide additional guidance aligned with our specific program requirements. So we're throwing out those specifics aligned with the implementation of early on, and that, yes, again, that does include Michigan mandatory special education for infants and toddlers. And we will stop for questions once we have reviewed the guidance document material in full, because we anticipate that you'll hear one thing and you'll say, well, what about this? And that might be the thing on the next screen. So we'll stop for questions if you can hold on tight, but feel free to write your questions in the chat. So addressing waivers for Part C requirements. We talked about this a little in last week's meeting, and this is continuing to be true, that neither MDE nor the US Ed have authority to provide waivers to Part C requirements. This would require an act of Congress to create legislation to create those waivers. So that said, as I think we've shared in the last few weeks, OSEP, or the Office of Special Education Programs, has provided guidance indicating that delays in meeting Part C required timelines due to suspensions of Part C services due to COVID-19 can be considered exceptional family circumstances, and those must be well documented. And we'll talk a bit more about documentation here. So any delays attributed to COVID-19 and our exceptional family circumstances need to be very well documented in the child's record. Keep detailed, and I would say consistent. The way you're tracking it needs to be consistent across your families. Consistent documentation of cancellations or delays of service deliveries, evaluations and assessments, individualized family service plans, transition conferences, any other interactions, and that would include who initiated the cancellation or delay and why. So if this was initiated by a family who's saying we've got 4 kids at home, we are not dealing with this right now, that is one way to make sure you document all of that within the child's file. And if it ends up being that you're short on staff, or you're just rolling up your plan that's required to start by May 7th, just ensuring that you document those nuances. As I mentioned earlier, the MDE may need to collect additional data related to COVID-19 responses and to enable accurate reporting in the FFY 2019 State Performance Plan or Annual Performance Report. So in the next coming weeks, we anticipate rolling out some guidance and additional data requests, which we will talk to you more about as guidance is developed. And really, I think I'd like to say with that, what we'd be asking for you regarding those data elements would be those things that we really need to collect and report for ongoing monitoring under the COVID-19 crisis. So it'll be just what we need to collect. We appreciate in advance any assistance you provide us with that. So in talking about the impact of the executive order, through this executive order, there is a requirement for early on programs to develop a continuity of learning plan for learning at a distance or services at a distance, as we've been saying, along with the requirements of the IDEA. So in your plans for providing remote intervention services, we expect to see what those plans might be, and that again is inclusive of Part C and MMSE. So the provision of remote services should be aligned with the beginning date in the continuity of learning plan. And this would be no later than May 7th of 2020. And this May 7th date comes specifically from the executive order. So that would not be something that we at MDE have any authority to change. So each ISD will determine whether services across the local service area will begin at the time of the earliest start date of the learning at a distance plan of any local education agency in their boundaries, or whether the services will begin in each LEA boundary in accordance with the start date in that LEA's plan. And I'm fully recognizing that LEA and ISD plans were put into effect April 28th. This May 7th date is specific to Birth to 5 programs and services. So this would depend on whether early on services are all provided by the ISD or whether some early on services are provided by LEAs, and thinking about those contracts that you have also with individuals or agencies, those also need to be addressed in your continuity of learning plan. So we've talked about the provision of remote early intervention services for infants and toddlers and their families to the extent possible, and really thinking about those individual needs of your families and of your service areas. So we know that each of your service areas are at different states of readiness to provide a remote early intervention and support. And we also know that many of you have been providing support since the first day of school closure. So there's been some amazing practice happening out there. In addition to the states of readiness of your service area, really think about those family resources in relation to accessing remote services. And we do recommend a variety of methods. So virtual visits is one way to do things. Other ways, you can include printed materials, phone contacts, emails, virtual visits, something else creative that we haven't named here, or a combination that can be used to meet individual child and family needs. Address those provision of services through agreements with your LEAs or through your contracts with individuals or agencies, and ensure that all of that is kind of in that one plan early on continuity of learning plan together. We would really recommend being mindful of stakeholder involvement. We know a lot of the work that we're doing at the State Department can't happen without stakeholder involvement, and it's so important as well within your service areas. So when creating and implementing these plans, it's important to engage your stakeholders, including your LICC, your families, your community partners. They can be invaluable supports to you in helping you think through obstacles, provide additional resources and support your staff efforts during this challenging time. Might be just the support that they're looking for. So as you're creating a plan to implement early on, some things to think about within that plan. The first would be alternative modes of communication and interaction that you anticipate will be used in implementing your services. And that could be those remote services. What do they look like? Addressing evaluations, assessment, initial IFSPs, periodic reviews, annual IFSPs, and transition plans and conferences in place of in-person visits and meetings to the greatest extent possible. So within your plan, include addressing all of those elements. Also considering those anticipated needs to reallocate federal early on or state school aid Section 54D funds to implement remote early intervention services and support. So we have addressed that in the last couple of TeleTuesday calls, is that we recognize that you may need some amendments to your budget to align with your family needs and your service needs. So changes in the use of any of these fund sources would require an amendment to be completed by within the MEG system and approved by the MDE, and also considering those adjustments that you need to make to staffing due to COVID-19. So as we have already addressed through the executive order, we will no longer be providing face-to-face services or methods for the remainder of the 1920 school year or until Executive Order 2020-65 is lifted and in-person face-to-face interactions may recur, whatever happens earlier. We would likely from the MDE be providing very concrete guidance to you whether face-to-face services can resume. And then finally, alternate modes of service delivery. As we've indicated, and I believe we've indicated for the last few weeks, programs are encouraged to be creative and to consider that capacity of your staff capacity and any of those resources available when planning for delivery of services while in-person services are suspended. Remember to individualize support for each child and family and thinking about and considering those family resources and needs. We've talked about some possible modes of service delivery, and others could include video conferencing, audio conferencing, sharing video recordings, telephone interactions, printed materials, emails, text messages, and using the good old-fashioned postal delivery services. And working with the family on deciding on appropriate day and times for any of these interactions is also really important. Several of the professional organizations for therapists have developed guidance specific to their profession to guide the provision of services during the suspension of in-person services. We have actually added several of those to the early childhood COVID resources on the MDE COVID-19 resource page. In addition, you'll likely find additional resources and supports as you continue to develop your continuity of learning plan. Okay, so we have more within our early on guidance memo, and Colleen and Laura will be discussing the remaining features of our guidance document. So I will ask Colleen to go ahead and take it away.
Good morning. One of the things that we wanted to point out and is pointed out in our guidance document is that we really need to keep in mind that parents are the decision makers and need to be fully involved in all of the decisions you make around adjustments to the services at this time. And they have a choice of saying they want to put services on hold. That's okay, just document it and keep track of that as an exceptional family circumstance. Just really make sure to keep them involved throughout the whole process of deciding what services might look like. They may have some really great ideas of ways that they would suggest that you try to do some of the services. And then we need to think about how services need to be adjusted, because the circumstances that COVID has created, it could really impact a lot of different pieces of the IFSPs and the way that we're doing our service delivery. It could impact the goals that the family has for their child at this time, the outcomes that they need to be working on. It could impact what services they need. It could impact the frequency or intensity or the method of delivering services. There's just lots of different ways that the services may need to be adjusted, and the ways we're doing things with families need to be adjusted. And instead of changing the child's IFSP, think about whether what you are doing on a temporary basis is something that's going to be a permanent change to the child's IFSP, or if it's something that's just something temporary to get us through this time. And in the cases where it's something temporary, then instead of holding an IFSP meeting and changing the whole IFSP, you can document that you've made a decision along with the family to change in this particular way. It might be changing which provider is doing the services. It might be the mode of delivery. It might be the frequency of how often or how long you meet, any of those kinds of changes you can document either by documenting it in a service log, a contact log, documenting any way that your service area chooses to make that documentation. This is where a lot of people have been asking about the continuity, the contingency plans. And it is a place that you could use a contingency plan for documenting that change. You're not required to for early on, but your local service area may require you to. Or it just might be a good way to have a consistent way of documenting and including that with the child's records that the change was made. And then if you are doing documentation that way on a temporary change, and it's just a deviation for a short period of time, then document it and provide prior written notice so that you're making sure that you're keeping everybody on the same page by having that prior written notice about that change. If it's a significant change, if you really need to completely change what services are provided, then that would be something that would warrant convening an IFSP meeting, pulling people together through an electronic meeting or however you choose to do that, and then making those changes completely to the child's IFSP. So that really takes care of how we have come up with it. You can document those changes, and we'll let Laura talk a little bit about responding to referrals.
Okay, good morning. So we talked a little bit about referrals in the last webinar, I think maybe the last couple. And so we talked about how when you receive a referral, when you're logging in the date of the referral, it's going to be the earliest date that it has been received. And just to specify, that means that whether it was received by the ISD, the LEA, or an agency that you contract with or have an agreement with to provide services. So that when they first receive that, you will need to use that as your referral date, and it starts your timeline. Again, and I'll say this over and over and over again, document any delays after that referral date, whether it's a delay for evaluation, a delay for the IFSP meeting, a delay in getting medical documentation. Document those delays, and those will be documented as an exceptional family circumstances, noting the connection to the COVID-19 situation. Again, we've talked before about CAPTA referrals, and I know that those came in during the period of time that you were shut down. The referral date does begin when you first received those referrals to your email or to your fax machine, whatever mechanism people used, mail, whatever date that it came into the ISD is the date that you'll use. Remembering that parents need to be notified about a referral, that still is a requirement. But again, document any exceptional family circumstances if there was a delay in notifying families. And then the IFSP meeting should be scheduled as soon as possible. That's going to look different for different families. Noelle talked at the beginning about guiding principles. Always go back to those whenever you're trying to figure out what you should or shouldn't do and how you should get that done. Another item that we discussed within the guidance document is eligibility determinations. But as always, use any and all existing information when you're looking at eligibility. So if there are documents that the parent can provide, we talked last week about medical documentation they might be able to pull down from their website with their provider. Whatever you have, use those existing information. And then remember to use established condition. Remember you have the opportunity to use informed clinical opinion, and use those when you're making determinations of eligibility. We talked also in the past about erring on the side of supporting families. So remember that if you don't have conclusive information, but you do believe the child is eligible, make them eligible, inform the family, make sure that they understand that that may change when you're able to do a full evaluation. So another topic was evaluations during the suspension of in-person services. And we do recognize that this is really hard. You have to be creative. This is where flexible and individualization comes in more so than any other time. So think about alternative modes for completing those evaluations and assessments. Some of those possible modes might be video conferencing, audio, sharing video recordings, telephone interactions, printed materials, emails, text messages. And again, like Noelle said, using that snail mail may be something that you need to do. I just wanted to note briefly, oh shucks, and there goes my, that's my clock. I thought I turned it to silent for the purpose of this meeting. Okay, it's 11 o'clock for those who don't know, so 11 chimes. I wanted to tell you on the ECTA site, there is there are some documents there, some ideas, some references, webinars that you can use when you're looking at evaluations. There was a really good webinar from on the ECTA site called Applying Assessment Principles to Evaluation for Eligibility Remotely for Part C, and a number of other video conferences in there. If you click on video conference and distance learning resources, there's some other pieces. EOT and TA has put out a tool. I know you guys, I believe you talked about it last week, suggestions for remotely determining eligibility using the IDA. There's also on the ECTA site, there's a course completion when teams can't meet in person. So that's an option as well, but just like evaluation and assessment, if you cannot get to the COAST rating, please do what you can to do that, but if you are not unable to, document that. And then I'll turn it back over to Colleen. There's a few different pieces in the guidance, but you can read through the rest of that on your own, and she'll talk about interim IFSPs.
Okay, so we have talked quite a bit about interim IFSPs over the last couple of weeks and the possibility that you may, it may be appropriate to use an interim IFSP as opposed to moving to an initial IFSP. And the guidance talks a little bit about that. And things to remember with the interim IFSP is that it is used for a child that you have said, yes, this child is eligible. I may not have all the evaluations that I need, all the assessments I need, or the family might not be ready to have a full IFSP meeting. There might be various reasons that you cannot do that the full robust initial IFSP. You may have been able to have one person evaluate, and that person from that discipline can say, yes, this child is definitely going to be eligible, but you haven't had the second discipline evaluate yet. Those would be circumstances where you may say, it'll be more appropriate for us to go to an interim IFSP at this point, and get services going that we know the child needs, and not wait for all those other pieces to be put into place before you start the services for the child. So that would be a good use of an interim IFSP. You really will have to make some decisions locally about and individually with each child and family about which is more appropriate, going with an interim IFSP that just has the minimal pieces of the IFSP there and gets the child's services started, or if you really feel you have all the information you need to do a full initial IFSP. And then there's another section in the guidance document that really gets into consent and signatures, which again, we've been talking a bit about that over the last couple of weeks. And IDEA does require a written consent for a variety of things throughout the process for evaluations, for assessments, for services. Written consent is a requirement, and we can't waive that requirement, but we do want to keep in mind those principles that we talked about earlier, with the flexibility, with the not letting things, requirements stall us from being able to get services for the children and families. And so we want you to do what you can. There's quite a bit of information in the guidance document about possible ways of obtaining that written consent. It might be through emails that are password protected. It might be through having a prior written notice that the parent responds to and says, yes, I want those services, or that evaluation. It might be something you send back and forth through postal mail. It might be there are some ways that people have creatively been in a Zoom meeting and shown the form and signed it so that you can see that it's been signed. Just lots of different ways that you can get that written consent. If you are absolutely unable to get the written consent, then document that you've made those attempts and the reasons that you were unable to get the written consent, but don't let that keep you from providing the services. Then in those cases, go ahead and get verbal consent, document that verbal consent, and then follow up later with the written consent. But go ahead and move forward with providing the services and the evaluations and different components. There's
Colleen, this is Christy. There are quite a few questions in the chat, but before we get too far away from interim IFSP, there are a couple of questions about whether the interim IFSP fulfills the timeline requirements for an initial IFSP and where it might be located or how to document that.
Okay. And it does not fulfill the 45-day timeline requirement. It doesn't change. Doing an interim does not relieve you of needing to have that initial IFSP done by the 45 days from referral. However, this would be a circumstance where you could then further document that there's the exceptional family circumstance of why you can't get that initial IFSP done within the 45-day timeline. And then when you get to the point of reporting your data, you would report it with one of the untimely codes, but that's for a parent and child reason, that you were unable to meet with the child couldn't be presented for whatever it was that you were trying to do and couldn't. So you would use those exceptional family circumstances in those cases. As far as where to find it, that will vary depending on your local system. Some local systems do have an interim IFSP, a place you can check off when you're doing your IFSP that it's an interim IFSP. Other systems don't have that. And then in those cases, you would need to probably use your initial IFSP form in your system, but somehow document that that is an interim and is not the full initial IFSP. And you will need to track which ones you need to go back and complete a fuller IFSP on later. We know that we're going to have to do some work with CEPI and figure out the best ways for reporting some of these. Alan will probably need to be in some of these conversations, and there's things we'll have to figure out about the MSDS reporting, and that's something we will have to get some more guidance to you on. So hopefully that answers some of those questions. And then back to the consent and signatures, there's in the guidance document, you'll notice that there's 3 different guidelines that you should be thinking about when you're looking for written consent through electronic means. So I'm not going to read through all of those, but go ahead and reference those as you're thinking about how to get that consent. And with the written consent, again, if it's taking extra time to get those written consents and that's what's delaying you from meeting your 45-day timeline or your 30-day timeline for start of services or whatever it might be, then you need to document that and list it as a exceptional family circumstance. The next topic that the guidance talks a bit about is reminders about FERPA and the protections of children's privacy of information. And if you are doing any kind of recording of video during this time period as part of what you're doing, if you maintain that video, and that's one of the key pieces of the regulations, is if it's something that you are maintaining, then it does become part of the child's record. And so keep that in mind as you're going through. Now, if you have a short video that you're using temporarily and you're not maintaining it, that changes that requirement. And it isn't necessarily always a part of the child's record then. So keep in mind the maintaining, and there are several other resources around FERPA and how tele-intervention is impacted with the FERPA laws. And you might want to look some of those up on the United States Department of Education site. We had the link earlier in the resources, and they've got some documents, they've got some recordings of webinars that they have done all around FERPA and how it relates to tele-intervention, especially during these special circumstances that we're under right now. And with that, I will pass things back to Laura.
Okay, I think I'm off mute. So last two topics in our guidance document are around the use of funds and additional resources. So we did talk about this on a previous webinar. You should feel very comfortable thinking about the use of your Part C funds and your 54D funds to support any and all needs at this time with the current COVID-19 situation. So that could be technology, it could be other supports that you need for virtual services, for virtual evaluations, assessments, holding the IFSP meetings, postage, whatever it takes for you to get this work moving forward and supporting families and children. You certainly can look at the use of those funds. Also, we did identify that the funds could also be used if you need to contract additional staff or pay for overtime with your current staff to address what we recognize will probably be a backlog. I don't know that anyone will not have a backlog in referrals, and trying to catch up with those missed services, evaluations, assessments, and IFSP meetings, periodic reviews, meetings to develop transition plans and transition conferences, whatever you need. If you have individual questions, my recommendation would be to reach out to your MDE consultant, so either Colleen or myself, and we can support you. If you're thinking about something, you're just not sure that it's going to work, let us know. We'll talk about it. And then additional resources, I think we've talked a lot about resources throughout this presentation. Just a reminder, links have been given to you in the chat. They're also on slide 4. And they are, especially, I was looking at the EOT and TA website this morning and want to remind you that they are located there. The MDE links, the US Department of Ed links are all right on the first page when you come in. The ECTA site and the Michigan Alliance for Family Sites, those are under a tab that's always there for you, which is your state and national resources tab. So feel free to go there to click on those links. And then of course, these webinars are recorded and they are posted on the EOT and TA website for you as well. I know we've covered a lot today.
Okay, so let's see if we can do some questions and answers here. Our first group of questions began with Jessica about what the definition of the school year early on, plans for balanced calendar, requirements related to providing services remotely through the summer.
Yeah, so I'm sure Noelle will be talking about this further. I just want to say that I know it is confusing. We had a lot of conversations as a team about what does that mean. Since we're not a school year program, we're year round. What it means for now is that, as Noelle had mentioned, the 2020-65 goes until the end of the school year. So for us, and when you think about the fiscal school year, is June 30th, 2020, or until in-person has been lifted. Now, we anticipate, excuse me, that there would be further guidance if it's going to be extended beyond that date. That's what we know right now for sure, is that you will not be providing in-person services until after that date. I know we've all been watching the news, listening to a variety of information, and it could be extended. We just don't know at this point.
And I would echo what Laura is saying and articulate that we would expect to see explicit lifting of these orders that would really clearly guide our work. So while we have this guidance language that we are suspending in-person services through the remainder of our year, which is June 30th, we would expect to see explicit guidance from the governor's office that would allow in-person visits. We have many programs across the MDE and across MDHHS that provide full year services. So we're going to need an explicit lifting of that executive order or a new executive order. And one thing we do anticipate is that with that, there's going to be all new guidance that we haven't seen. You know, there's going to be recommendations on how to maintain in-person services with social distancing, requirements in place, and what that could look like. We're seeing a few examples emerging in other states and through home visiting model programs where we would expect to see not just a broad blanket lifting of our allowance for in-person services, but specific recommendations and requirements on what that would look like moving into our continued idea of what a new normal looks like.
So Noelle, there's also a question about the due date for the continuity of learning plans.
Yep, so we would expect services to start and those dates. And again, you're not submitting them to us. Remember that. These are ISD plans that you would be keeping within your ISD, but we would expect that to be complete by, well, the executive order expects that to be complete by May 7th.
And enacted by May 7th.
Correct.
We have a couple of questions. One about whether we need to provide prior written notice, confirming that we should or must require prior written notice to every family because the method of contact is changing for everyone, correct? Was a question.
That has been our guidance. I think I'm going to have Colleen talk a little bit more about prior written notice. We have been, I think this is probably our third week of mentioning the importance of using prior written notice. And after participating in the early childhood special ed webinar last week, I did note that there were some differences in that. Colleen, do you have more that you want to add to prior written notice for our work?
Well, I think you pretty much covered it, that the importance of the prior written notice is really to make sure that you're that everybody is on the same page, really having transparency about everything that's going on. And so our guidance is that we do prior written notice for any of these kinds of changes, which, yes, would impact almost every child in one way or another, either what the changes are that are happening or and being implemented on a temporary basis, or if the family is saying, you know, let's put services on hold, you probably want to document that in that way as well, so that you have proof and a record in the child's file that those requests have been made and that they were made by the parent, that you were recommending. You can document what services you offered and how you offered to do them, and that the parent chose not to accept that at this time.
So there's a question also, Colleen, about prior written notice. Can that be text or emailed? Excuse me.
Yes, I think you should think about the same kinds of modes that are mentioned in the signatures and consents, that if you have a secure way of providing those through an email, definitely you can do that. You do have to be very careful about personally identifiable information, and think about those pieces as you're sharing any documents that have that personal identifying information and figuring out ways to protect that. But yes, you can be very creative in how you are doing those prior written notices, and then keep a record of it in the child's file.
There's
Again,
been
flexibility.
Yeah.
Thank you, Colleen.
There are a couple other questions, and it sounds like here around prior written notice, someone's asking about if the learning was still happening in the natural environment, it would not necessarily, you wouldn't necessarily need to have a prior written notice that it's happening in the natural environment, but it's happening remotely. And so that's one of the questions, is if it's still happening through virtual, but it's in their home, do they have to do a prior written notice? Does that make sense?
That does. We may want to take that back and think about that one. My first instinct is that it will depend on how it's written into the child's IFSP, how the method is written, of how the delivery will take place. And, but I think that that's something that our team should talk about before I respond further than that.
That's okay, we can answer that next week. Okay, I just wanted to make sure we kind of covered the prior written notice questions, and then Christy, where were we at with some of the other ones that came in earlier?
So there were a couple of questions that were getting at evaluation for Michigan mandatory special education. It seems like maybe there was an assumption to hold on to those referrals or not to evaluate. Would you provide comment on that, please?
I would say, and any Laura and Colleen can jump in, but I would say the executive order is pretty clear that we should be moving forward with MMSE referrals and evaluations.
Yep. Yeah, because I think it's important to recognize that in our guidance document, we specifically state that this guidance is for children who are receiving early on services only, or children who are receiving services through early on and Michigan mandatory special education services. So I think it's important that both of those are happening. Yes, move forward, march on, do the best you can.
Please
Guiding
do.
Principles.
So another request.
Go ahead.
Sorry, just another request. If you could please say specifically what data needs to be collected And then there were 2 requests to repeat the information about the child outcomes summary.
Okay,
Yeah,
I saw that.
Go ahead.
I saw the question about what data need to be collected, and I was wondering in reference to what? Would that be the report that we'd be asking for in a few weeks or something else?
I believe it was when Colleen was documenting or talking about documentation.
Gotcha. Okay, I'll let Colleen take that then.
Sorry, somebody just clarified yes for the report. Teresa did. Data
Okay,
needs
got
to be collected for the report.
Yeah, I think they're, and by report, are you talking about reporting in MSDS, or are we talking about writing? I don't know. I just want to clarify that.
I do too.
It sounds to me like it's in reference to when Noelle talked about the continuity of learning plan, and that we will then eventually need to have a report on some information.
Yeah.
That's what I thought. And like I mentioned then, we don't have those elements collected yet. We will need to get back with you on that. We're just trying to let you know that something is going to be coming. And we really, the documentation is imperative with this, because we're going to be looking we're going to be needing to collect data like how some things that we've talked about so far, this is not all inclusive, has been getting a sense of what service areas are doing to deliver services to children and families during the COVID-19 pandemic. So getting an understanding of all these different modes of service delivery that are available. You're changing your services no matter what. What does that look like? What does that look like during this time? And that's one of the reasons we are giving it some time before we ask for a report, because some of you are still working to get that together. So it'll be what does service provision look like? And then we may be collecting some data on any delays in meeting timelines. What would some of those reasons be for that, and how has that impacted your practice? So those are a few of the things that we're talking about now, but as I mentioned, we probably will not be getting back to you on those report requirements for a few weeks.
So we're getting very close to the end of our time. There are a couple of outstanding questions related to child outcomes, and one related to the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos's request regarding the Part C to Part B transition waiver. And so I don't know if you have a short answer for either one of these. I would like to say to everybody that we do record all the questions in the chat, and a reminder that the webinar will be posted and available for everyone. So maybe a remark on the waiver request, and then we'll make the recording available for everyone and can address questions next week as well.
I would say the waiver request falls pretty strongly in Part B, since this would be an IEP by 3 waiver request. We do know there is one. And I also believe that this was talked about in the early childhood special education webinar that you had last Friday. So I'm not sure if there would be some Q&A that you might be able to mine from that.
Just that the information is out there. It's that there's been no action in Michigan as of this point.
No, and that was a global request for a waiver. So there have, I mean, as far as I know, the waiver has not yet been approved. That's going to have to go through the specific process that I discussed at the beginning of this webinar for that waiver to be approved.
Right, and we can share it. We'll send out the link for that document that was released by the Secretary of Education. It was on April 27. But again, at this point, it doesn't have an impact on Michigan policy.
No.
No, and it was a letter to the legislature. I don't think that there's been a response yet at all. So it's,
No.
a request, and we don't know what's going to happen with that.
Right, the secretary made a request to the US Congress.
Yep. And we're over time, so we'll get back to you about the coast. I know there was a question about suspending services, a periodic timeline. There's a couple other things I've written here about MMSE. I do want to address the MMSE just really briefly. It really, you're obligated to do that. You know, and early childhood special education evaluations, that falls under the Part B OS guidance, but our MMSE birth to 3 falls under ours. So I understand that there's some concerns about quality evaluations. I know that EOT and TA has worked hard to put together a TA document. It's being routed in the department right now. We're hoping to get you some more information on that. But in the meantime, reach out to EOT and TA if you have questions specifically about how to do that, how to do evaluations for MMSE birth to 3.
So I think that will conclude our webinar for TeleTuesday today. If you want to turn on your cameras and wave to your neighbors, you can. Nancy, do you have anything to wrap us up?
I think we're good. Thank you, everyone, for your time today. As mentioned, the recording will be available later this week to all of you. And before you leave, if you want to turn your camera on and wave or say something to your colleagues, they might appreciate that, being all alone at a home office right now. So.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in.
Go team.
Go team. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.